Hey there, welcome back to Zombie Tactics. The title of the video today is the 21st, the 18th, the 14th, and the 2nd. And it'll become apparent why in a second. I like to think outside the box a little bit, and I like to think things through and just do little thought experiments. And this is a thought experiment about how we got where we are with the government controlling so many aspects of our life, and specifically having to do with proposed legislation which outlaws, bans, regulates the sale of certain kinds of firearms, things that are sometimes called assault weapons by politicians who want to make up terminology to demonize people and inanimate objects. But in thinking about this, people often compare the prohibition of firearms to the prohibition of alcohol in this country. So I was doing a little bit of study about that, and I was noting that, we had the National Firearms Act in 1939 was passed, and that was in response to a massacre, the St. Valentine's Day massacre of some fame, and some of you may have heard that term before. There have been movies made and books written all about that. Well, what did they do? They said, well, what was this massacre done with? It was done with machine guns and short-barreled shotguns and stuff like that, stuff that the gangs have. So what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of machine guns, or at least control them, and we're going to get rid of all these short-barreled shotguns and stuff, because that's what the gangs are using, and then we'll get rid of the gang problem, and we'll never have another massacre like this again. Well, we can see how well that worked out. It didn't work out very well at all. Just as today, machine guns and short-barreled shotguns were not used very often in massacres. They were hardly ever used. And, in the same sense that today assault weapons and assault rifles are hardly ever used in crime or massacres. It's just that they're very vivid things that happen in the mind of the public, and a horrible event happens and everybody gets emotionally wrapped around their own axle, and now we've got to do something, and we end up doing all the wrong thing. So in 1939, the NFA, the National Firearms Act, pretty much got rid of the public's ability to own actual machine guns or short-barreled shotguns. And I thought that was funny, because the comparison to Prohibition comes in for me, because I noted that it was just a few years earlier, 6 years earlier as a matter of fact, in 1933, that the 21st Amendment to the Constitution got passed. Well, what was the 21st Amendment to the Constitution? The 21st Amendment to the Constitution was what got rid of the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. What was the 18th Amendment to the Constitution? It was what brought about Prohibition, which was outlawing booze, basically. Specifically, it outlawed or allowed the government to pass later legislation which outlawed the sale, the transportation, the manufacture, importing or exporting of what they called intoxicating spirits. In other words, alcohol, whiskey, beer, anything that had alcohol in it. And we needed to get the 21st Amendment to get rid of the 18th Amendment, because the 18th Amendment was the thing that brought about Prohibition in the first place. You needed a later amendment to supersede the earlier amendment. The 21st gets rid of the 18th. And then I got to thinking, why in the hell did we need a constitutional amendment to prohibit the sale of alcohol? Why did anybody think that was necessary in the federal government? And it turns out that this is a clue to a meaning about all kinds of things. We're told all the time that we cannot possibly figure out what the framers of our government, what the writers of the Constitution meant when they passed the Second Amendment to the Constitution that said, you shall not infringe the right of the people to keep, meaning own, and to bear, meaning carry around, weaponry. I'm going to do a few videos on this, because a couple of different angles to take on this, to let you know what they were really thinking. Now, a lot of times what we will do is we will say, well, we'll quote this, George Washington said this, Hamilton said that, Madison said this, Jefferson said this other thing, Adams said another thing. We quote all these important figures that basically say, yeah, the people are supposed to be able to have guns, and they're supposed to have guns that are every bit as good as anything that the military or the police carry. And the reason for that is it's our last hedge against tyranny, and we don't like standing armies anyway, and people can use them for all the kinds of other lawful purposes too. And so we throw those quotes out at people, and people will still come back who are anti-gun and say, yeah, but certainly they didn't mean X, Y, Z. We'll talk about that in another video. But the whole thing that got to me was they realized that with booze, something that isn't even mentioned in the Constitution at all, that they did not have the authority at the federal level to regulate it, and I'm using regulate in the common meaning of that word, which means to pass laws which limit it or prohibit it or tax it or something like that. They did not have the authority, they didn't have the constitutional authority to even outlaw alcohol. It wasn't there, and they knew it. They knew for a fact that the Constitution did not allow them any authority over something that isn't even mentioned in the Constitution. Why? Because they actually respected the Constitution at that time. And they said to themselves, you know, we have this thing called the principle of enumerated powers. It means that we're only supposed to be able to do things at the federal level and in Congress that are specifically laid out in the Constitution. And since the Constitution doesn't specifically lay out that we have the ability to control alcohol or any food or drink or anything like that at all, we need a constitutional amendment in order to grant us the authority to outlaw alcohol. They didn't just make it up and say, oh, well, we've got to do this. Now, by the way, keep in mind that most of the time now when we pass laws against anything, people want to come out and say, oh, it's the Commerce Clause that gives us the authority to do that. Well, the Commerce Clause goes all the way back to the ratification of the Constitution in the first place. I think it's in Article 3. Somebody look it up. I'm not sure. And that's the original Constitution before we even had the amendments to the Constitution. Okay? That's an important thing, and I'm going to get back to that. Article 3 to the Constitution, or whatever article has the Commerce Clause in it, was part of the original Constitution, and then we passed the first 10 amendments to the Constitution to explain what we meant in that first part of the that Constitution that we just passed, to make some things abundantly clear in case they weren't clear enough already. And everybody knew, up until the time of Prohibition, that the Constitution did not allow Congress to do something as simple as control the sale of alcohol in the United States of America. And that's the reason why they had to pass the 18th Amendment, because they knew that it would never get past the Constitution. Now, what does this mean to us? It means to us that, well, we know what the Constitution meant because we knew what everybody knew it meant. Everybody knew it meant you couldn't do something as simple, like I said, I'm repeating myself, you can do something as simple as limiting the sale of alcohol without passing a whole constitutional amendment to grant you that authority, because the Constitution is supposed to limit the government to doing only the things that it says and nothing more. Wow, what a radical, weird concept. But you'll have people come out today and say, oh, well, you know, the Commerce Clause says that we can do anything that has to do with interstate commerce, and since just about anything has to do with interstate commerce, we can do just about anything. and that on its face, you can kind of see that, that's faulty reasoning, because we know exactly what people meant by the Commerce Clause, clear back to the origins of the Constitution, and all the way up to the time that Prohibition came about. Nobody took that Commerce Clause to mean that you could do something as simple as regulating the sale of alcohol. You had to have a constitutional amendment. Okay? Constitution only lets you do what's in the Constitution. Now, if that's the case, I want to go back to the Second Amendment, and I want to go back to the clear language of the Second Amendment. Now, just as in the case of the 18th Amendment, we brought about a constitutional amendment that said, hey, we can regulate booze and we can outlaw it and all this stuff, it took a constitutional amendment to supersede that constitutional amendment. The 21st came along and said, okay, we're getting rid of all that stuff in the 18th Amendment. You can't outlaw booze anymore. Keep in mind what happened. We passed the Constitution itself, which included the Commerce Clause, this thing that keeps getting used over and over, and we get beat over the head with it to say that the government can do anything it damn well pleases. And after that part of the Constitution was passed, the main body of the Constitution, then we passed the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the second being among them. And the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, otherwise known as the Bill of Rights, are pretty much like this. They're pretty much saying this. They're saying, just in case anybody doesn't get it, we're going to lay out some specific things that the government absolutely cannot do. We're going to say the Congress can't pass laws establishing a religion. The Congress can't keep you from speaking your mind, particularly when it comes to speech against the government. The government can't keep you from, the Congress shall make no law respecting, the freedom of the press. You can print things even radically critical of the government, and the federal government can do nothing about it. Now later on, of course, the language in the Constitution says Congress shall make no law about those things, and nobody thought that really meant that nobody in the United States government anywhere could do it, whether at the state or the local level or whatever. As a matter of fact, states did in fact pass all kinds of laws about things like freedom of the press, freedom of religion, or whatever. Those were rights that were kind of reserved to the states, and that's the way everybody took it to be. Later on, we had the 14th Amendment come along and explain that, like, no, that stuff really does, at least for the most part, apply to the states as well. You can't be in California, and California has a certain religion that's the official religion, and another state has a religion, or in some states you can limit freedom of the press and things like that. No, you can't do anything like that. The 14th Amendment came along and explained or clarified or added some meaning to those original first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Now the funny thing is, the Second Amendment uses language that's very different than the other parts of the Bill of Rights. It doesn't say Congress shall make no law. It says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. It doesn't even say who. It just says it can't be done. I take that to mean that nobody can do it. Not the federal government, not the state government, not the local government, not the dog catcher, not the county sheriff. Nobody can do it. Now, why is that important? It's important because we have all this stuff coming along right now saying, oh, the Commerce Clause allows us to regulate firearms. Wait a minute. The Commerce Clause came about first, and then the Second Amendment came along to explain everything that was in that original body of the Constitution. It's as though everything in the Constitution was supposed to be clear enough, and now we come along and we say, just in case anybody doesn't get it right, we want to explain some things. And one of them is, nothing in this Constitution that we just passed allows you to control the right of the people to keep and bear arms. You can't infringe upon that. Well, if what we just passed in the Second Amendment was to explain that nothing in the Constitution allows the federal government to do that, and the 14th Amendment says that all of these rights go to the states, how is it that the Commerce Clause, which came about first, doesn't get superseded by the Second Amendment, which came about later, that says you can't do it? And in the clear language of the Constitution, and in the clear way that people took a look at prohibition and realized you can't control alcohol even without a constitutional amendment, because the Constitution doesn't allow you to do it, where are we with this business about the federal government coming along and Dianne Feinstein pretending that she can pass some kind of assault weapons ban, which the Constitution does not in any way, shape, or form give her or anyone in the federal government or the state government or any level of government the right to do? That's my question, and that's the big thought experiment, because in my mind, just as the Constitution was clear, without even any mention of alcohol, that you couldn't control alcohol without a constitutional amendment, we have a case here where the Constitution is absolutely clear that you cannot infringe upon the right of the people to keep and bear arms. And we are pretending we don't need a constitutional amendment. We can just run roughshod over the Constitution and pass any laws we want. That shows you how far we've gotten from our original principles as a republic. And I think that that's one of the things that we have to begin to reclaim, is those original principles and those original ideas. And the place that it starts is first in our own minds, and then we've got to start taking the republic back, one step at a time, one vote at a time. That's Zombie Tactics for today, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.